Hey, this is Calvin, pronouns he, him, his.
And today we're going to talk about HR 1, which is currently, it's actually being voted as of today in the House, and it's going to move on to the Senate pretty soon. What's HR 1, Calvin?
So HR 1 is a bill that has a lot of different voting reforms to try to make the process of voting more reflective and more fair. There's plenty of cool things like setting up ways to combat gerrymandering, which is selecting voters for candidates, not voters choosing candidates. And I'm also here to learn much more about it as we go along. So I'll be fulfilling a bit of the present student role in this.
Yeah, and for full disclosure to our audience, I made the slides today, and I've been studying this a lot, but I'm learning about it too. It's not easy. It's complex. It's going to take a lot to fix democracy, yeah. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, and we're going to be focusing specifically today on one part of HR 1, which is the voter registration modernization, particularly promoting internet registration. So we'll be going into that today. And the first part of this is pretty, it's actually something that's been implemented in 40 states already. And so the basic premise of it is that we'd have online voter registration available in all federal elections nationally. Now, to be clear here, HR 1 also proposes automatic voter registration as well. So there's that on the table as well, but this is another part of it. And what it would do is it would make it so that each state must provide an online voter registration application. The other thing that it does is it makes it so that voters can actually use this online portal to update their voter registration information. There's some good justifications here. For instance, in every state where they've been tracking labor costs as to what the amount of labor that was done. Like for instance, the old-fashioned system involves basically it involves actually having like paper registration forms and then entering those into computers, which is just very labor intensive. So in every state where they actually tracked the labor costs and the changeover, they found that the costs fell significantly. In the case of Delaware, for instance, it was $200,000 in the first year. And the election officials from those states agreed that online registration significantly reduces the likelihood of mistakes being made. And so the other aspect of it was that the DM voter registration is increased in the states with the registration. What are your thoughts on this, Calvin?
Well, I think that the savings speak for themselves in that regard. But I also feel that there's money saved in traversal. So I live in Chicago and have usually lived pretty close to a city, and there's plenty of access to these facilities. But thinking about larger states and more rural areas, I grew up initially in a rural high school area, and some people, I think it's a real struggle to allocate, a good portion of a day. Who knows how long the line is to go for this. So I think online registration just makes sense. And then, you can verify and go in person for the more edge cases. I think this just makes sense.
It's very interesting. If people are curious, by the way, if you're curious, while this is going, I just want to let everybody know in the audience that you can chat with us, and we will see your chats. So like send us a message. We're on Twitch, Periscope, YouTube, and Facebook Live. So send us a message if you have any questions. Also, you can also text us if you're watching. So feel free to text us with any questions you have, and we'll try to keep up on the text messages too. So, so just so everybody knows. So if you've got questions about this, and we've got slides. In fact, I'll paste the link to the slides for you. But I also just want to share that we've got in the slides here different links to the Brennan Center's data on this, and it's quite extensive. So there's a lot of like really good stuff here you can take a look at. If you look at the table of contents here, they have considerable studies on like the savings in money, the increase in the voter rolls, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so we've got some more justifications for this too, which is that online voter registration is popular. The 46.4% of the population register online in Arizona, and 26.7% register in Utah. Where online voter registration exists, people use it, and it's a lot quicker. You don't. We could go into the details of that, and I'd be glad to like do that in the Q&A at the end. But like it's a lot faster, and like the results actually come back like within 24 hours, whereas before you have like the paper forms and things like that. And now, you know, it actually cuts down a lot of things.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
I think registering should be easy. I mean, voting is essential in a participatory democracy or democratic republic. So, I mean, you'd want registration to be easy. You want more participation, because that's how our elected officials and representatives will know where the people stand and where the people's will is. So, just makes sense to me.
It's part of the design of the system. The idea is that if you're representing people, then their needs get taken care of.
Yeah.
And right, if we're not representing people, people's needs aren't met. So okay, let's keep moving on.
Let's do it.
So now there is some dissent about this. For instance, one of the things that's often brought up around this is the Heritage Foundation. This was what they said specifically about the voter registration online. They said that HR 1 constitutes a recipe for massive voter registration fraud by hackers and cyber criminals through online voter registration that is not tied to an existing state record, such as a driver's license. So we've got this here too. And so I thought, let's take a look. Is this true? Is this false? And so we're going to kind of explore here how there might be deceptions here. And something we're going to be following loosely here is a work. This is from Jack Harich's Truth or Deception. And he asks us to consider 4 things. We're mostly going to consider 1, 2, and 4. 3 will be kind of implicit as we go through. We don't need to check it twice. But what is the argument? What is this trying to persuade us of, right? And trying to give us a bill of evidence to prove to us that we should support it. And then it asks, are there any common patterns of deception present? Now, this can include what Harich calls strategies of deception, but it can also just be simple logical fallacies, and it also can be messaging tricks too. And then we ask, are the premises true, complete, and relevant? And then finally, does each conclusion follow logically and strongly from its premises?
Yeah.
And so now we come back to this, and as we come back to this, right, we could reformulate this into this kind of form, which then gives us kind of this premise conclusion thing, right? Because the premise is online voter registration is not tied to an existing state record, such as a driver's license. So it's like saying, because online voter registration is not tied to an existing state record, such as a driver's license, HR 1 constitutes a recipe for massive voter registration fraud by hackers and cyber criminals. So we've taken what they wrote and kind of flipped it around to show how it's logically structured.
This takes me back to my intro to philosophy classes. If P, then Q type assessments. But yeah, is there a logical through line? Does this make sense? Does each point along the way hold weight? And it's just a great tool to have in your toolkit for assessing like different opinions and the different origins from where they come from.
Yeah, and like it helps us recognize that like all logic has this form, right? Like sometimes what people do is they skip a step somewhere, and so because they're skipping a step, they make the worse our arguments seem like the better, and so this helps us organize how this is structured. And what's interesting also is that when there are different patterns of deception present, a lot of times the patterns depend on what the order of the arguments is.
Mm.
So
how that particular consequence will happen. So you might fear that consequence, or they're just making what appears to be a leap in conclusion without showing how we get to that particular one. So those two stand out the most to me.
Yeah, those are really important ones, and like false promises is a double-edged sword. Sometimes people falsely promise something that's good, and sometimes they falsely promise something that's bad.
Right. Okay.
And so it can, like, what's interesting about these is they're often not alone. Secrecy is kind of like the salt, like you can just like you salt it with a little bit of secrecy, and that can help you out a little bit. I think one of my favorite examples that Jack Kerouac uses is to take the very Orwellian example of 2 + 2 is 4, right? Well, sometimes is it 5? Is 2 + 2 6? Well, if a politician's lying, they might, like maybe they'll do 2 + 2 is 5, right? And they'll use like a little bit of secrecy, and so you can't really quite tell. Is like those are the places I really struggle with. Is the places where there's secrecy, like because I don't want to make a hasty conclusion, but like in those spaces, when 2 + 2 is 5, sometimes it's hard to tell. But then as the politician gets more desperate or more bold, they might do 2 + 2 is 6 or 7, and then people get disgusted by it and outraged, and it falls apart. So
I have a quick question, and I want to see if this one would qualify as a false enemy. If someone states that everyone who supports protected bike lanes, so they would have a curb in between them, if they state everyone who supports protected bike lanes is anti-car, is that an example of false enemies?
Oh, well, what would be presenting bikers in a kind of negative light. as if they're the enemies of drivers. So
Right.
so
Right. When they could be completely, they're not contradictory, but they're being put forth as if they are.
Right. And so you know, like it might be, it happens in situations with scarcity a lot, right?
Mm.
Like there's scarce road resources.
Right.
And so maybe bikers aren't drivers' enemies. Maybe they actually have a lot to work together on.
Right.
But if you constantly if you frame it in a way that you turn people against bikers or use that as a way to try to rally up a partisan base,
Yeah.
that's a false enemy.
Okay.
And then wrong priority is a really interesting one, because if you can recognize that somebody's presenting a priority that's really not a priority, that it's actually something that goes against like the priority that it purports to support, that actually there's a hidden agenda somewhere. And a priority is presented as a way to mask a hidden agenda. That we can use that as a way of figuring out, okay, what's going on here. So now if we're looking at this right here, what to you stands out as a deception strategy here?
All right. I'm letting the audience have a moment.
Yeah,
but I'll have a go at this too.
Yeah, if people are watching, feel free to right now just you can send a text in if you want. I'll put the number back up. You can tweet us. I'll put our Twitter up here too while we're at it.
Hit it.
Send us a text. Tweet us. Let us know where you're at with this. And so basically, so what are the deception strategies here? What stands out?
So one I noticed is a bit of a false promise, and I don't even think it's to the whole thing. I think they've snuck in another little one with that last bit, that comma, such as a driver's license. I think that's a bit of a false promise, because I think they put that forth to argue to the car driving base. And growing up in a rural area, almost everyone has to have a car because you can't get anywhere. There's nothing nearby you. You have to use a car to go out. So I think it's a bit of a false promise in that they're saying, almost like they're saying, everybody's got a driver's license. That's not entirely true. There are plenty of city instances where there's public transit where people exist without a driver's license, or they have literacy issues, which is actually a fairly large portion of the society, and they can't pass the written part of a driver's test. So just assuming that there's a driver's test and kind of leaning on, everybody's got a car, everybody's got a license, I think is a false promise in and of itself, on top of the overall premise they're putting forth here.
Yeah, I think it's really kind of interesting, right? And people in rural areas, right? A lot of people who grew up. One thing that was interesting is that a lot of people who grew up under Jim Crow can't actually go to a hospital, or weren't born in a hospital, so they don't have a birth certificate, right?
Yeah.
And they may not have a driver's license either. They may just take buses, and so they might have other forms of ID, but they don't have a driver's license.
Yeah.
And so so it's an interesting thing, because it's kind of saying okay, well, this driver's license, this is we're if we also, I think of it this way, right? If we if we just had driver's license, if everybody just went and registered with their driver's license, everybody would vote, right? Like this is very like very shady kind of stuff. It doesn't seem to be very real about that.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you see in here with the discussion?
Full disclosure, you and I, we had a quick look at these, so I do know. I want to cede the floor to you, the expert. Why don't you hit the
all right. I'll show you. So
yeah.
I'll show you what I did a little bit of work on this. The idea that it constitutes a massive recipe for voter fraud, registration fraud, even though this is from Heritage Foundation's resources, they don't have a single citation in there about instances of online voter registration fraud. Now, maybe there are. I'm not saying like in Heritage Foundation's database, actually, they had 193 examples of regular voter fraud since 1982.
I'm giving us that cat bump right now.
Oh yeah, we need the cat here. Yeah. Hey there. But like, so they had like 193 examples. Now, in fairness to them, one of the instances had 50 people in it. But this is since 1982, right? This isn't enough to make a difference on one of the elections they were talking about, let alone, I mean, you have some instances where some elections in local elections are over 190 votes, but we're talking about, 193 examples of regular voter fraud in all that time. So they're not citing any examples of online voter fraud, even though it's already happening in 40 states. You'd think they'd have some data on it if they actually, were doing something.
You'd think they'd want to put that front and center if they had, evidence of, in a large amount, such instances.
Yeah, but they say this is a recipe for massive voter registration fraud. Now, they say recipes. So they're not saying it's a certainty, but I mean, 2 + 2 is 7 here,
Yeah.
Like this is not 2 + 2 is 4, we're not playing with equalities here anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And then the pushing the hot fear button, which actually you had brought up earlier, this one with the, using the language of hackers and cyber criminals, that really does kind of drive it home, right? Like that's a big part of it. And then again, still no examples of online voter registration fraud, right? So we're talking about this, but it's something that it even kind of gets a little bit into the territory of false enemy. I don't think I actually said that it was a false enemy thing, because like there are hackers and there are cyber criminals in theory, like nominally speaking, that would want to do that. But like a good example that Heritage himself actually gives is the example of like communists during the Cold War. While it's true that like the Soviet Union was competing with us in that time, the notion that like there were all these communists plotting our demise constantly, perpetually, like there's a sense of hyperbole about it. Like the communist is not what they say it to be, right? There's all this red baiting going on, and so like this does have some a flavor of that as well. Though I didn't necessarily put it on there.
Right. These words, hacker and what was the other one? Cyber what? I'm almost
cyber criminal.
Cyber criminal. Like these are terms that they are effective, and they are rather alarming to many in our communities. And they don't make an effort to say like despite encryptions or despite best efforts they're going to just leave the fear, set it out there, and let imaginations run wild. And that's the part of this, is like they're not acting in good faith when they just drop hackers and cyber criminals, because of course there's going to be protections on the data. Of course there's going to be double encryption and processes for keeping and maintaining that data. And it's the vote. It's people's registration. So we regard that really highly. So we're going to protect it accordingly. To assume that it's just going to be open season and people are imagining like every hacker, thousands of people around the world are just going to have full access, is like, that's wrong to leave in people's imaginations on purpose, I think.
Well, we're going to show this movie in 2 weeks. What is it? Dark Money?
Okay. Yeah.
That movie?
Yep.
Yeah. We're going to be showing that in 2 weeks. It's a film about Montana and how easy it is to just run attack ads on somebody in the last 30 days of the election.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like taking a crowbar to somebody's kneecap. I mean, it's just it's vicious. And they, in the state of Illinois, we were trying to pass the fair tax.
Yeah.
And they did that, despite the fact that we had our own PAC on the other side that was paid for by the governor. It was easy for them to run commercials that basically said, this is going to raise your taxes. This is going to be really just things that weren't even true. And there's stuff in HR1 that actually prevents this. So
nice.
So it's HR1 has got a lot of stuff in it. And if you're a corporation who's behind those ads, you've got to actually put your name on the ad. So you can't just get away with, the Americans for Prosperity, no, it's going to say Charles Koch on it.
Right. If you're going to make a wild claim, you're going to put your name on it, and you're going to own it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's very good in that way. And then the other thing, circling back into this a little bit. Also, another thing to note is that it's not like people. It's not actually like they're not making people who are doing online registration have to provide identification. It's just that, like, for instance, you can use the last 4 digits of your social security number. You can use your driver's license ID. You can use, if you can't present either of them, then they actually have to work with you and try to figure out something. It's not something that the idea is to make it so that people can actually vote, and not be skipped over. And that's only true. The registration when you're voting, having something more in some sense of ID. That part is actually only if it's your first time registering to vote. I don't know exactly. We could look it up how that works with automatic voter registration, but they're trying to think of everything here.
Yeah, and I like the idea of the government agency taking that next step and working with someone, assuming they want to vote and assuming that is a good thing for them to be pursuing, and then working with them to get there. I think that's hugely important. I think in a democracy, you should be invited to vote, not procedurally barred. I feel like that's the wrong approach. You should celebrate the more voices that you hear in an election.
The architect of HR1, John Sarbanes, says that voters shouldn't have to go through an obstacle course in order to vote.
There it is.
And what you bring up here, you're really getting at something here. So the next point is wrong priorities. When you said, when you were saying before about being harder to vote, there's the interesting question here, right? Is 33% of the population is not registered to vote. right? The priority shouldn't be on disqualifying voters when there's so little evidence for this. We talk about that in other places, and we're glad to talk about that again. There's very little evidence for voter fraud. It doesn't impact any elections. Why are we setting a priority to make it harder for people to vote when it suggests a hidden agenda? And although I'm not going to talk about it here, we can talk about it more at length. You do see that people like Hans von Spakovsky, who's in charge of this whole project at the Heritage Foundation, that Spakovsky has a whole record of bad faith in this space. So it really makes a good question as to is this just about barring people from voting so that your candidate can win easier?
Yeah, I think it's done and dusted, that particular premise and conclusion.
Yeah. So let's get through this a little bit. Now, one thing we could also examine is logical fallacies. One of the most common logical, I'm not gonna go through this extensively, right? One of the most common logical fallacies is an ad hominem attack, where you attack the person's character rather than their argument, which is a form of red herring, which is where what you do is you distract. What you do is you fight somebody on something that actually isn't what you're arguing, in order to not have to actually argue the point that you're weak on.
Right. It's arguing against the person or entity saying the thing versus discussing the pros and cons of the thing.
Yeah. And that way, if you can get the person to argue about themselves, then you might be able to distract them long enough that nobody notices. And so there's a number of logical fallacies. This is a little bit harder, and if we're facilitating workshops on this, we'll have to practice at this a little bit more of how do we do this. But I've got a list here of logical fallacies, and I'd invite you all to kind of just think about here. If you can, like, is this a false dilemma? Well, like, is it a false dilemma means like, where you say either it's A or it's B, but neither option is actually really what it truly is. So that you can make somebody, it's actually similar to a straw man argument in some ways. A straw man is where you say the person who you're arguing with was arguing something that you're not actually arguing, in order to make it easier to defeat them. But it's not a false dilemma where, like, there's no either or here, and it's an interesting question, because this one actually is very, very sneaky. This one's sneaky because there's actually only two fallacies that are being used here, and I looked through the entire list of fallacies. So, like, if you go back to the last slide, there's a list of fallacies, and I'll share the link to the slides. But the problem is, if we look at like the appeal to possibility, this is all about saying that, like, because it's possible to say that we have a really strict standard for registration that's more stringent, right? Then we could say that, like, okay, this is a high ideal, but realistically, we actually know that that's not a problem. So it's an ideal that's actually like we're saying it's possible that, well, actually that's more than nirvana. I should say that's more than nirvana, right? That we're making a too high of an ideal to actually that actually we need to achieve. It's unrealistic. but it's saying that like if we have the stringent standard of a driver's license, that's going to solve all these problems of voter fraud. Voter fraud's not even clearly a problem. And then the other one, appeal to possibility, says in this case, this says in this case that that because it's possible that there'll be massive voter registration fraud, that we should guard against it.
Right.
But just because it's possible that someday I will be a multi-billionaire does not mean that I'm going to be a multi-billionaire. I don't even want to be. But
it's always possible that a bird can poop on you, so just never go outside. You know,
right?
Like,
exactly. You know,
there are these weird conclusions that they're making, you know, based off of like taking a possibility and taking it to its extreme,
without any cogent statistical validity here.
Right.
There's no cogent statistical validity here. So I didn't do the third principle, but we know that the premises are not very good. But if we come back to here, right, online voter registration is not tied to an existing state record, such as a driver's license, and HR 1 constitutes a recipe for massive voter registration fraud by hackers and cyber criminals. Well, because the premise, right, like because this premise is not like that great, it's not, the premise is not great. So we're not going to say that this conclusion logically follows from it.
I always think of stuff as a series of bridges, and I always think of like, does it hold weight? And I just don't see these like noodle bridges where you're like moving a Hot Wheels car across. I just don't see those noodle bridges holding. They're just not very strong. Yeah.
That's a good one. That's a really great way to noodle bridges. I like that.
Yeah, just like, did you guys build those?
Yeah, right. And so, yeah, so it doesn't hold. Does anybody in our audience have any questions? Glad to answer people more questions. Glad to brief this again. You know, for anybody, anytime. If you want briefings on HR1, we're giving as many briefings as anybody can stand. And if you want to learn how to give a briefing on HR1, we'll show you how to do that too.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts from you, Calvin?
My thoughts are this is a big old bill. There's quite a bit in there. There's so many lovely things. So at the top, I mentioned movements against gerrymandering, which are delightful. We mentioned real quick automatic voter registration, voting or registration online for if you move, and that's just a tip. So I highly suggest people join me in learning about it. And I'm still going to these presentations and getting caught up on what this big old bill has. I think we're all learning as we go. And it's really exciting stuff because this bill looks like it can definitely happen, and it's got a lot to offer.
Yeah. And if anybody in the audience wants to get involved, just reach out to us. If you want to start learning how to brief this, we'll teach you. We have a Discord. We have all kinds of ways to reach us. We hold events every week. We do watch parties. So just find us on Twitter at Cause Conscience. Thank you so much, everyone. It's been really great having you. It's been really great working with you today, Calvin. This is fun. Yeah. And thanks, everyone. Look forward to seeing you again as we go.
All right. Take care.